show you how to calculate how much epoxy you need for your resin table project. And I'm going to show you on this 120 by 48 inch.
I wasn't doing anything. Hi. Welcome to our bonus room. This is the room where we send all the kids when we don't want to listen to them. We got a TV up here. We do family movie nights up here. We hung this TV on the wall like 2 years ago, and it's just looked like this. We have this tiny little chair to serve as a media console. We got cords and wires running all over the place. So I thought it was high time we remedy this. I'm thinking a giant hutch, like 10 feet long. Solid white oak. I want there to be a ton of storage for all the electronic accoutrements, but I also want it to look cool. And then my wife told me that she wants it to look like something that came out of a French farmhouse. What now? So we're gonna build that, whatever that means. Giant hutch, French farmhouse, storage. Okay. Here goes nothing.
So after sitting down and doing some design work on the computer, this is what I came up with, a solid riffs-on white oak cabinet. If you recognize those doors, it's because I built them 2 videos ago. You can go watch that video right here up in the right-hand corner. Now, whenever you're building a solid oak hutch, the first thing you're going to want to do is grab some 3/4 inch MDF and rip it down into a bunch of strips. I know, weird, right? You see, I wanted to make 4 big, beefy oak posts to build the rest of the cabinet off of. But I didn't want to get solid oak because, well, that would have been really expensive to get 4x4 oak. So I decided to just make some faux oak posts and fill them with MDF. So after cutting down a bunch of strips of MDF, I smeared some glue on them and I clamped them up. And then like magic, the glue was dry, so I took all the clamps off. Now I'm only showing 2 of my 4 that I glued up here, but basically now I had some MDF blanks. Now I made these a little bigger than I needed them to be because I didn't want to have to glue them up perfect, so after they were out of clamps, I went over to the joiner, I got a flat edge, then I went over to the planer, and I planed them down to be about 3/4 of an inch smaller on all sides than I want my actual post to be. Next, I went over to my miter saw and I cut the nasty little ends off until they were the correct length. And then it was time to hide the fact that there's any MDF in this piece whatsoever, which means I have to wrap those MDF blanks with oak. So I ripped down some pieces of oak on the table saw and I went over and I cut little tiny squares because I'm going to wrap the MDF in little squares. No, I'm just joking. I'm going to put a little end cap on the top and bottom of the MDF posts because, well, nobody's ever going to see it and it's probably pointless. I mean, if somebody spilled a drink under the cabinet, you're not going to want that MDF wicking up that moisture into the leg and making it blow apart, I guess. So this is probably a good idea, but also probably unnecessary. Now, I made my little caps a little bigger than they needed to be because I would never be able to get them perfectly centered on top of those posts, and then I used a flush trim bit in the router to trim them down so they were absolutely perfect, like this. I had a cap on the top and the bottom. Now it's time to wrap the sides. So I grabbed some more riffs-on oak and I went over to my miter saw once again and I started rough cutting my pieces to length. And I needed a lot of pieces because there's 4 posts and each post has 4 sides. So that's 4, 8, 12, 16 pieces of white oak. Now I'm going to do a 4 mitered wrap, if that's a thing, because there's 4 miters. Sure. So I started by cutting a 45-degree angle on one side and then I adjusted my saw so it was exactly the right width to wrap those pieces of MDF. And I cut a 45-degree angle on the other side. Now when I say exactly the right width, you want this dead nuts. And I did not get it right on my first try. I started a little bit big and I just worked my way in, taking small passes off until I got it perfect. Then with my saw set up correctly, because all my MDF is the same size, I could go to town and rip down all of my pieces. So now I got a bunch of pieces with 45-degree angles on both ends. Next, it's time to kind of lay out how I want all the pieces to look, because some pieces are darker and some pieces are lighter, and I want it to look like a natural post. So I kind of played around with the grain on each different piece, making sure that it all melted together and flowed nicely. And then I used painter's tape to hook all 4 pieces together to make it easier to wrap around my MDF. Basically, I would just take a long strip of painter's tape like this, and then very carefully I would line up those mitered seams so that there was no gaps, and I would press nice and firm and let the tape do the rest of the work. I just worked my way along until all 4 pieces were held nicely together with tape, except for my last seam, because, well, that would be impossible because we're still in 2-dimensional woodworking here, and we haven't gone 3-dimensional yet. But when we go 3-dimensional, then we can tape up that last seam, but we can't tape up the last seam until we put the MDF in there. I mean, it's kind of a whole process. Anyways, next I smeared glue in all my cracks and crevices, and I am talking about the wood specifically here. It would be weird if I smeared it in my cracks and crevices. Now I'm making sure to get plenty of glue in between each of those 45-degree seams, and then I just put a little dollop of glue on the actual panels, because that's really just to keep the MDF from sliding around, so I don't need as much glue there. Then I take my MDF blank, I set it on there, and it should center itself in this box as I fold it together. So as long as my measurements are correct, I think we'll be good to go. And, oh, good thing I left that glue bottle there so you can't see very well, but it folded up quite nice. And now that we're in 3-dimensional space, time, we can tape that final seam. As you can see, I got my nice oak caps on either end. Now I left my glue up sides a little long. I'll trim those down to be perfectly flush after I take the tape off. This was a couple days later. I got busy doing other stuff, and as I peel the tape off, you see we have nice tight miter seams, which is perfect. And once I get this built into the actual piece, nobody's gonna know that these donuts are filled with jelly. Or in this case, these posts are filled with MDF. Just as satisfying, not nearly as delicious. With all of my tape unstuck, I gave the legs a nice sanding, just hitting all those mitered corners because they were pretty sharp and didn't want to get splinters in my little fingers. And now it was time to go back to my SketchUp file and see how the heck are we going to put this thing together. Now, these end caps have a secret. Yes, it looks like a normal post with stiles and rails, but aha, there's a removable panel and there's going to be some secret whiskey storage on either end. How, you say? I have no clue. We're going to have to figure this out as we go. But it worked on the SketchUp file, so it should work in reality, I think. Next, I cut down some more riffs on white oak, and we basically have to glue up some L-shaped pieces. I know that sounds confusing, but a lot of this is going to be confusing. Just stick with me. It will all make sense in the end. So anyways, I glued up these L-shaped pieces. Now these are going to be my rails connecting those 2 posts, but they have to be this L shape because I'm also creating a void for that secret whiskey storage, kind of on the top there. And then there's this weird back panel that's, well, going to keep the whiskey from falling into the cabinet. So next we have to create that. So I milled up some more pieces of white oak, and then I went over to my dado saw to cut a nice rabbited groove down one side of each of those pieces so that I can inset a piece of 1/4-inch riffs-on oak plywood. See? Nice little rabbited groove right there. I did it at first pretty skinny, and then I decided that I needed to make it a little wider. So I did. I know you're confused. This is just one of those confusing projects. Just trust me, it will make sense. With those rabbited solid oak pieces cut, it was time to cut some panels to put in the middle. So I took some 1/4-inch rift sawn white oak ply, ordered this at my local wood supplier, and it is pretty beautiful. I was super happy with the veneer. I mean, one side was definitely better than the other, but that's pretty typical with most veneered plywood. Once I had those pieces cut to the right size, I added some glue on those rabbets, and then I clamped my plywood onto those pieces of solid wood. And it looked something like this. This is gonna work. I'm like 60% sure. By that time, my little L pieces were all dry, so I took them out at clamps and I gave those a nice once over with the sander. Now, because I have to make 2 identical end cap pieces for this hutch, I purposely glued these up twice as long as I needed so that I could get 2 pieces out of each section. Now there's a top section, which is the skinnier ones, and then there is a bottom section. The top section's like 3 inches and the bottom section's 5 inches. Don't ask me why, that's just how I designed it on the computer. Next, I grabbed 2 of my legs and a top piece of my L-shaped glue up and a bottom piece of my L-shaped glue up. And I clamped them into the correct orientation between my 2 legs, or posts, whatever you want to call them. And then I marked out for some dominoes, because, believe it or not, I'm going to use dominoes to hook all these pieces together. So once I had those marked, I grabbed my domino joiner. I used the 500 for this because it was the closest one to me. The only downside to the 500 versus the 700 or 750 or whatever that number is it's harder to do the patented hip thrust with the smaller one. This took a while to mortise out all the holes in the correct locations because I had to do it both on the leg and the L piece, and I had to do it on both sides of the L piece so there wasn't a piece just floating out there in space, but I got it all marked and measured, and pretty soon I had everything mortised out and it was ready to hook it together. Now you're going to notice as I'm doing the dry fit on this that L piece on the top and bottom sticks out past those posts on the back side. And you're probably like, what the heck? You didn't measure very well. Why do they have those little tails on there? That's kind of weird. But don't worry, it's all going to make sense here in just a minute. So this big beefy boy is one end of my soon-to-be hutch. Next, I went and grabbed one of my panels that I made while I was waiting for that glue to dry, took it out of clamps, and oh, now you see why they got those little tails. Now the reason behind me doing the back like this as opposed to just slapping the piece of 1/4-inch plywood right onto those posts is that I needed the extra depth to store the whiskey. By doing the back this way, it gave me an extra inch of depth, which will allow me to store 6 bottles of whiskey. Plus, we still have to inset a panel in the front of this to hide the secret storage, hence making it secret storage. So pretty confident with my dry fit and how everything was going together, it was time to add a little glue to those dominoes and make this marriage permanent. So I pulled out my patented glue spreader, I smeared everything up with a little Titebond 2, and I locked it in place, threw on some clamps, and I had one of my 2 pieces complete. And then I did the other assembly, but I'm not going to show you that one because it was identical to the first one. I will say, these things are heavy. Starting to wonder if it was necessary to fill them with MDF. I mean, the reason I did it is because I wanted them solid so that I could hook tenons into those posts and not just have them floating in the middle of a void. But, boy, this thing is going to be stout. After taking them out of clamps, I gave them a nice sanding, and then it was time to measure for all of my connecting rails in between. Did I mention this hutch is going to be 10 feet long? I'm just now realizing how incredibly large this thing is going to be. Holy flippin' cow. I don't even know how I'm going to lift this. Anyways, that's tomorrow Jason's problem. So over to the miter saw, I started rough cutting some riffs on oak to length. Now I already milled up and planed these pieces off camera because you don't need to see that every single time. I mean, it doesn't matter if you see me do it. It just matters that I did it. And I did. Anyways, I cut my bottom rails to match the bottom rails on the end caps, and I cut my top rails to match the top rails on the end caps, so everything would look nice and cohesive. Now, I had no clue how I was going to mark these for the dominoes because I'm just one man and I couldn't hold everything in place perfectly. So I carried my end caps over to my table saw that was nice and flat, and then I just stuck the rails on my outfeed table to hold them in the correct position so that I could mark to drill out for all my dominoes. After I did those bottom rails, I flipped the whole thing upside down, and I just repeated this step for the top rails. And then once I had everything marked out, I did something I've never done before. Patented knee thrust. Yeah, that's right. I'm leveling up. But don't worry, I reverted to my old ways and used the patented hip thrust for the rails. And boy, does it work like a charm. Next, I had to add all the divider pieces for my front rails, making it essentially a face frame. These dividers are going to section out where I'm going to have doors and where I'm going to have drawers. So I clamped my top and bottom rail together, making sure they were perfectly lined up, and then I marked everywhere I wanted a divider. There's only going to be 3 of them, so that should be pretty easy. And then I marked perfect center on all of those pieces. Now, I already built the cabinet doors for this piece, like a month and a half ago. So I have to make sure that these are perfectly the right size to accommodate those doors, because they're completely finished. There's no changing them now. So I made a little door template that should be exactly the right width, and that helped me lay out where all the dividers needed to go. Then just to double check before I hook these things together, I went and grabbed the doors. Remember these things? Look pretty good, don't they? And I plopped them in that space and just checked all my measurements to make sure they lined up with the correct reveal on all the sides. Once I was happy with how those fit, I grabbed my domino joiner again and I started drilling more mortises to hook everything together. First in my divider pieces and then in the top rail and the bottom rail. And then I glued the whole assembly together. But again, I mean, you've seen me glue things up like a million times, so here it is, sped up, just to prove that I did it. And then I just had to wait for the glue to dry. But not one to sit around and twiddle my thumbs, I decided to use that time to start working on the panels to hide that secret storage on those end caps. So I picked out a nice piece of 5/4 rift-sawn oak and I cut it down roughly to size. Now I'm going to do one glue up large enough to cut both of my panels out of. So after rough cutting it to size and milling it up, I went over to my workbench, smeared some glue in the crack, and clamped it together. By that time, my face frame assembly was all dry, and it was time to do one more step before I hook the entire thing together. Now, apart from these face frame dividers, there's going to be internal dividers made out of 3/4 inch oak ply. But I needed a way to hook those dividers inside the cabinet. So I pulled out my router with the router track, and using a 3/4 inch router bit, I cut a nice 3/4 inch dado right down the center of each one of those dividers. This created a nice slot that should allow me to slide a piece of plywood inside after I get the entire structure of the frame assembled. Now, because this glue up is going to be kind of crazy, meaning it is so massive, I decided to pre-glue all of my dominoes into my rails and face frame pieces ahead of time. That should just help make the overall glue up a little less stressful. And when you're gluing up a 10-foot cabinet, well, less stressful is the way to go.
This video was sponsored by Policy Genius. Now, a lot of us think about our financial future and how much money we should save every month, how much money we should spend every month, but the funny thing is, a lot of people don't incorporate buying life insurance into their financial planning, which is weird, because all that financial planning is great if life is perfect and nothing bad ever happens, but what if worst case scenario, you lose your life or somebody in your family loses their life? That's why buying life insurance is actually a very important part of financial planning. That's why Policy Genius makes it incredibly easy to find the right policy just by going to policygenius.com. They compare quotes from a bunch of top insurers and they make the process so simple. And if you don't believe me, just check this out.
With Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options are 100% online and let you avoid unnecessary medical exams. Your work life insurance policy may not offer enough protection for your family's needs. Even worse, it may not come with you if you leave your job. Policy Genius gives you unbiased advice from a licensed expert support team. They have no incentive to recommend one insurer over another, so you can trust their guidance. That's probably why they have thousands of 5-star reviews on Google and Trustpilot, because they really are the smarter way to buy life insurance.
Now, you're probably wondering, all right, all that sounds great, but where do I go? How do I sign up? What do I do? Well, that part's so easy. You just go right here.
Check life insurance off your to-do list in no time with Policy Genius. Head to policygenius.com/Bourbon Moth or click the link in the description to get multiple life insurance quotes for free and see how much you can save.
Huge thanks to Policy Genius for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to the project.
All right. All of my frame pieces should be prepped and ready to assemble into one giant cabinet, carcass, frame, thingamawhatsit. Now, I didn't want to try and do this all by my lonesome, so I enlisted the help of my good buddy Craig to just kind of hold things in the correct location as we went along. If for nothing else, just for moral support. So he made sure nothing fell on the ground while I smeared glue on all the dominoes and used a big old framing hammer with a rubber end to kind of smack everything together. Now, I didn't do a dry fit on these because, well, they were huge and I was in a hurry. So I just had to really hope that I marked and measured everything correctly as I put this thing together, because it's already got glue smeared in all the places. And lucky for me, my measurements were spot on and it actually came together pretty easily. We did have to use 2 sets of pipe clamps holding hands to get the back all clamped up, but it only took about 10 minutes. It was in clamps, and as far as I could tell, everything was pretty nice and square. I think, but I mean, it's 10 feet long. Who the heck knows? The next day I came out and I removed all of the clamps because they just didn't go with the final look I wanted in the piece. Now, I purposely didn't install the back of the secret storage until I got the glue up done because I wanted to be able to trim it down in case it didn't want to slide in between the rails. And I did have to trim it down slightly, so I'm glad I waited. When I design things in the computer, I only kind of halfway design them, so I never think about how I'm going to attach various parts and pieces. So at one point I thought I was just going to glue this back panel on, but it was hard to get clamps in there, and it's going to be on the inside of the cabinet where you're not going to see it, so I opted just to drill some countersunk holes and use some glue and screws to hold it on. Does that make me less of a real woodworker? Oh, probably. Do I care? Well, yeah, actually, I do. Am I going to let that stop me from moving ahead and doing it that way? No, not really. So I smeared some glue on there, plopped my back panel in, and I screwed that sucker in using GRK screws I picked up at Home Depot. How do you like that, Norm Abrams? Then I had to do the exact same thing to the other side because, well, they're identical. And now you can see I have this nice void in here to store some alcohol. Next, I went over to my panel that I glued up for my doors, took it out of clamps, sent it through the planer to make it nice and smooth, and I cut it to size to get my 2 door panels that I will somehow hook into those end caps. Don't ask me how. Haven't thought that far ahead yet. Took a little while to get it just right. Now, I want the reveals on this to be super tight because I don't want anybody to know that it's there. Next, I went over to my table saw and using this raised panel jig that I made like 8 videos ago, I made it into a raised panel. because I got raised panels in the doors that I already made, and I thought it would look nice and, well, it would look less like a secret storage. Now, these were big panels, and I didn't take the time to tune in my jig just right, so I did get a few burn marks as I was cutting these. I know, don't judge me too much, but it actually looks worse than it really is. It's mainly because I just kept stopping halfway through my cut. They'll sand out. See? You can't even tell they're there. And then I went back over just to test the fit one more time, because who knows, it could have magically changed somehow. I mean, it didn't, but it could have. Now, my first thought was to use some magnets to hold these panels in place. But then I was like, why use magnets when I could use full inset Euro-style hinges that have built-in adjustability, and then I don't have to actually take the panel all the way off. It'll be hooked on there and just swing open. So very carefully, I drilled out the holes for my hinges, and I mean very carefully because I could not go too deep, because the way that raised panel is cut, I didn't have a lot of material to work with there. So those hinges just fit in there. Then I used a square to get them nice and straight, and I screwed them in place. And it was back over to my end caps to mark very, very carefully to install the clips for those hinges. I really had to be precise here because I didn't want to accidentally drill a bunch of holes on the inside of this cabinet. And the tolerances, as I mentioned, were super tight, so I didn't have a lot of wiggle room. So after measuring, and then measuring again, and then measuring one more time, I installed the clips, and the door, well, it didn't fit. But that's only because I hadn't adjusted the hinges yet. Calm down. I added some tape on the door so that I could actually open it back up. I adjusted the hinges, and this time, it slid in there nice and snug. Now it rubs just slightly, but that's okay. I'm still gonna sand this whole panel down, and then it should fit perfect. But for right now, that looks pretty secretive. I mean, if I didn't tell you it was there, you wouldn't know it was there. I know what you're thinking. How the heck are you going to open that thing up? Well, don't worry, I have a plan. Is it a good plan? I don't know. We'll find that out in a little bit. But the important thing is I have a plan. Next, I took off those clips that I meticulously spent so much time getting in just the right position. Because before I really move forward, I need to pre-finish the inside of this secret storage compartment, because it's going to be way easier to do it now than later. Now, to finish this whole piece, I'm using the same thing that I used on the doors, which is Rubio Monocoat's pre-aging serum, for lack of a better word. Now, if you read the bottle, it says specifically on there that this is not a finish. It's actually a chemical that reacts with the tannins in the wood to change the overall color. It doesn't add any protection, but that's okay. I have a plan for that we'll discuss at a later time. Next, after pre-finishing the inside of those cabinets, I whipped up some quick shelves just to add in the middle to maximize the storage. I gave those a quick sand, and then I pre-finished those as well with that same pre-aging liquid. Now, I know you're probably looking at that color and you're thinking, I don't like that color, it's ugly. Well, don't worry, that's not the color. It dries over the course of 24 hours and then it completely changes color. So you just have to wait and hold your judgment until the end of the video. I installed the shelves on either end just with a few pocket holes because it was quick and effective. Sue me. And then I reinstalled my cabinet hinge clips and made sure my doors still functioned properly. All right, now to figure out how the heck we're going to make these doors open without any hardware. This is what I came up with. After playing around with a lot of different thoughts in my head, I decided to make this nice little swing arm. The cabinet door will be here, this arm will swing and open the cabinet door. But you got to be able to do this not on the door side because it's got to be secret. So I'm going to use a string, and the string is going to be attached to a spring that's going to be attached to a shelf that's already in there, and when you pull the string, it's going to create this little action. And if you're still confused, I don't blame you. This might be one of those things that you just have to wait and see it in use to really understand it. Will it work? I have absolutely no clue. Have I ever done this before? Definitely not. Have I ever seen anyone else do this before? Nope. Does any of that matter? Probably. But the important thing is, I have a plan. And that's half the battle. Now, because I have 2 secret storages, one on either side, I have to make 2 setups. So I started out by making these 2 little swinger arms. I shaped them over on my oscillating belt sander, and then I added a little round over, just pretending my trim router was a miniature little router table. So next I took my little swinger arms over to the cabinet and I stared at them for like an hour, trying to figure out exactly how I was going to do this. I knew how I wanted it to work, but I didn't know exactly how I was going to attach everything. So I went to Home Depot and I bought all sorts of little eyelets and springs and cables. The only problem was they're all the wrong color. They're shiny zinc or stainless steel. So I also grabbed a bottle of gun bluing. Now, if you've never used gun bluing before, this is actually a pretty good hack for taking new hardware and instantly putting a beautiful patina on it and making it look old. I mean, it's like instant magic. You just dunk the metal in the liquid and it changes colors. I can't explain it. I'm sure it's got something to do with science and chemicals, but that is beyond my pay grade. So I just started throwing a bunch of stuff in there just in case I needed it. The most fun was the springs because see, it's shiny and silver looking. You dunk it in there, wiggle it around, ta-da-dee, ta-da-da, and boom, old looking. Pretty sweet. Now I will say this doesn't work with all metals, it won't work with aluminum, and it won't work with stainless steel, but it seems to work really well with zinc. I did buy these like coated zinc bolts because they had a smooth shaft at the top, which would create a good pivot point, and I did have to sand off the coating in order to get that to work. But it worked, and the top is the only part you're going to see anyways. Next, I needed to drill a hole in my swinger arm for them to pivot on. So I marked out the dead center of both of those arms, and I went over to the drill press and, well, it's not rocket science, I drilled a hole in it. Then I inserted my bolt, which was just a tad smaller than my hole so that it would spin freely, and looks like that should work nicely. Now, I need a way to attach the spring to the swinger arm, and then I need a way to attach the cable to the swinger arm, both in the same spot. So I pre-drilled a hole in the end of both of my swinger arms. I keep calling it a swinger arm. I just made that up, to be completely honest. It probably has some technical engineering term, but swinger arm sounds pretty good. Anyways, then I took one of these little eyelets and I screwed it into the end of each one of my levered arms. Now, see, that doesn't sound as cool. Now I needed to attach my spring to that eyelet. So I just kind of used the little mechanism, wiggled it on there, twisted it around until it was locked on. Like that. Then I added one of these little eye bolts, eyelets, whatever you want to call it, to the bottom of the spring so that I could hook the spring to the shelf. Then I took my cable and using that same bluing liquid, I made my silver cable also nicely patinaed and more brownish black looking. Then I threaded my cable through that eyelet that I hooked on the end of the swinger arm, and using one of these little crimps that I bought at Home Depot, which is unfortunately aluminum, so the bluing didn't work on it, I crimped the cable onto the end and permanently hooked it in place. Now when I mocked this up, I used string, but I don't want it to wear out over time, so I figured cable would probably last a lot longer. My assembly looked something like this. Finally, before I installed the whole assembly into the cabinet, I took some more of that pre-aging liquid and I rubbed down my swinger arm to just make it the same color as everything else, because that seemed like an okay thing to do. Now I'm going to have to thread the cable up through the top of the cabinet so that you can access the cable when you open one of the drawers. At least this is my general thought process. Now that I have the cable threaded through the top of the cabinet, it should be as simple as hooking the spring with that little eye bolt to my shelf. The only problem is I didn't know exactly where I should position that spring for everything to work properly. So I played around with this for a lot longer than I'm willing to show you until I finally settled on drilling a hole towards the front of the shelf because that seemed to make everything function the best. So after pre-drilling a little hole, I fiddled around trying to get that eye bolt screwed in, which I eventually did. Now the next question is where to anchor my swinger arm on the inside of the cabinet. Again, I had no clue. So I grabbed a screwdriver and I just kind of kept moving it around while I pulled the cable until I found a spot where the swinger arm would be out of the way enough for the door to shut, but would still have enough room towards the back of the cabinet to function properly. Once I found that exact spot, I pushed really, really hard with the screwdriver to make a little mark, because I'm a real woodworker. And then using a apparently bent drill bit, I pre-drilled a hole for my bolt. Pretty deep. Again, glad I stuffed this thing with MDF, or there'd be nothing to bolt this to. Then I put my bolt through my swinger arm, and I wanted to space it out away from that post a little bit, so I added a nice patina to a few washers, and I used those as little spacers so that the swinger arm wouldn't rub against the inside of that post. I used a socket to tighten everything down, and now when you pull the cable, it's like there's a little person with a finger in there that should push that cabinet door open. I think. There was really only one way to find out, and that was reinstall my cabinet door, take the tape off, which is the only way I could open the door, and pray that this works. So I shut the door, I pulled on the cable, and voila! The door opened right up. Man, it's the simple things in life that truly make you happy. I wasn't thrilled on the overall action of it at first, so I added some more little eye bolts to help guide the wire in the correct location, and pretty soon I had that thing singing like a songbird. So I installed it exactly the same way on the other side, this time a little bit quicker because I knew what I was doing, and yeah, worked pretty good on that side. I also discovered that it worked better if I drilled a bigger hole at the top of the cabinet and I installed an eyelet on the top of that rail so that the cable wouldn't rub on the hole as it passed through the cabinet. Now, right now, there's just this giant length of cable sticking out the inside that you have to pull on, which obviously isn't going to work in the long term. So I had to figure out a more permanent solution. My thought was, if I bring this cable around the inside, well, that'd tuck up nice against the face frame. The problem was it created too much friction and it made it too hard to pull. So, following the path of least resistance, I decided the cable would work the best if it could go straight across into the divider that I would eventually put there to separate the different cabinet sections. Which means that before I can truly get this thing functioning properly, I need to install the dividers that separate the different cabinet sections. So it was back over to the table saw to cut down some 3/4 inch plywood to the right width, and then I ripped it down to the right height. Then I went back over to my carcass, I smeared some glue into those nice channels that I cut out earlier in the video, which should make sliding these in pretty darn easy. Now you'll notice there's only a channel on the face frame. Don't worry, I'm just gonna screw it in through those rails on the back. I know that seems crazy, but believe me, it worked wonderfully, and it's actually gonna benefit me for installing the back panel later down the road. Just trust me on that, because you're not even gonna see that portion in this video. Ooh, cliffhanger. After I got my first and second panel installed, would you believe I did the craziest thing? I installed the third panel. and I did it the exact same way. I know, pretty nuts. Now, with all of those panels installed, I could run this cable all the way across and permanently attach it to the other side. Now, this is suspended above where any drawer is going to be, so it won't be in the way. And you should be able to open one of the drawers, reach inside the cabinet, find that cable, lightly pull it down, and open the secret compartment on the outside. So I added I keep going back and forth on eye bolts or eyelets. I don't even know what these little things are called, the little screws with the circle on the end. Anyways, I added another one of those on the panel so that I could attach the cable. I threaded the cable back through one of these little crimp things, and then I added a piece of tape to hold the crimp in place while I fiddled around with these giant crimpers that are definitely overkill for this small gauge wire. Anyways, I crimped, I removed the tape, and I cut off the excess wire. As simple as that. Clip. Now, all you should have to do is reach in and pull. That magic little finger flies down and opens the cabinet, and the cool thing is it comes down and it stops, and the cabinet door holds it in place. So it'll stay open until you walk over there and reset it. And by reset it, you just have to move the door and the spring resets it automatically. I mean, if it wasn't for the fact that I literally just showed thousands of people how I did this, you'd never even know those compartments were there.
Whew! That was a lot of work. And we're not even close to being done with that thing yet. So please come back next week for part 2, where, fingers crossed, we'll get that thing finished. And see if it fits upstairs. I didn't really think about that when I was building it, that you gotta go around a corner, up the stairs, turn another corner, go up more stairs. I don't know. Might be taking a window out. Oh boy. Oh, check the video description for links to all the tools and supplies and everything we use. There's also a link down there to our Patreon. We're just about to head to Germany to meet up with one of our patrons who won our last contest and won a chance for us to go over to his shop and build a project with him. So if you want to enter for a chance to win that sort of thing, well, you got to be a patron. There's a link down there.